Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation on hamstring injuries in football, ideas for a successful return to play. Before starting my presentation, obviously a big thank you to Marco Beato for inviting me and for all the nice work that he's doing, especially with this channel with a lot of free content from other really good researchers and clinicians. So the idea of the presentation today is to give some tips, some ideas around rehabilitation process and how to return football players to play with confidence. Let's start with an introduction around hamstring injuries in football and looking at the impact of hamstring injuries in professional football. On average, 7 events per season in European professional clubs, according to the Exxon study in 2022. And the interesting thing about hamstring injury is that despite all the studies and the implementation of technology, there is an increase of hamstring injuries looking at the last 21 seasons in European football, an increase of 24%. But also, the other interesting fact is that the injury absence days caused by hamstring injuries have increased as well. It was 10% overall in the season 2001-2002, and is become now 20% during the season 2021-2022. Also, the other interesting thing is the high number of re-injury. Around 18% of all reported hamstring injuries were recurrences, and over 2/3 of them occurred within the first 2 months after return to play. When we look also at the hamstring injuries, when we talk about hamstring injuries, we're using an umbrella term because in reality we're talking about three muscles with different characteristics. And if we consider the biceps femoris as two separate muscles, taking in consideration the long head and the short head, we're actually talking about 4 different muscles with 4 different characteristics and 4 different muscle activations as well. And from an epidemiological point of view, looking at the Exxon study in 2012, majority of hamstring injuries in football are affected biceps femoris, the 84%, and only a small percentage actually affects the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus, so 11% and 5%. It's also very important to look at classification in football, and we know a first way of classifying muscle injuries just to go from grades from 0 to 3, basically looking at the extent of the injury. And if we look at that, 57% of the reported injuries in football were grade 1. A lot more than 27% of grade 2, 13% of grade 3, and only 3% of grade 3. But also the discussion around classification can become even more complicated when we start adding not only the extent of the injury, but also the area of the injury and the structure of the injury. And that's what the BAMI classifications done. So the British Athletics Muscle Injury Classification has divided hamstring injuries, or in general muscle injuries, into myofascial injuries, so adding a letter A, muscular tendinous, so muscular tendinous junction injuries, and intratendinous junction. And that comes from the work described firstly in 2014 by Pollock and colleagues. And this factor becomes important because some studies have looked at correlation between the area affected and return to play. So the first study to describe this correlation was the Pollock study in 2015, and that's a study on track and field athletes. And they've noticed an increase in time loss when the injuries extend into the tendons compared to the myofascial injuries. If we take this into professional football world, two recent studies, the Macaulay and the Thiers study in 2022, look at the correlation between MRI reports and time loss in professional football. And both studies are really interesting, and also both of them showed the Macaulay one, for example, that the grade 1A had a significantly shorter time loss compared to 2C, and the Thiers study concluded that there was a longer layoff periods with injuries that extended to the intramuscular tendon compared to myofascial injuries. The limitations of these two studies are due to the fact that they only took in consideration a small amount of injuries, and both of them, they looked retrospectively only at injuries happened within one football club. So there's definitely need for more studies, for bigger studies with more participants, and also across maybe different clubs and also different leagues as well. And then the other interesting thing, and we'll talk more about how this then relates to rehabilitation and return to play, is the mechanism of injury. The three studies that you see cited on this slide are three interesting studies on mechanism of injury. The Danielson study is a systematic review of hamstring injuries in sports, so not specific to football. And it's interesting, especially from a running mechanics point of view, in terms of mechanism of injury. While the Grunwald and the Klein study are two studies, two video analysis of hamstring injuries, both in the German league, in the Bundesliga. And while the Grunwald study is very specific only for hamstring injuries, the Klein study is more like generic video analysis of all injuries. And within the study, there's also a section on hamstring injuries. So when we look at the mechanism of injury, we can divide in two main areas. So one is sprinting type of injury. Another one is a stretch-related pattern type of injury. So sprinting injuries are the one that happen during the acceleration phase and during high-speed running, and especially for most studies, the late swing phase seems the most likely time during the running gait when an injury can happen. Well, the stretch-related pattern can also be divided in two types of different mechanisms. The closed chain one, so movements like braking, like a lunge movement or landing movement, and open chain, like the kicking, where you have basically a hip flexion and knee extension combined type of movement. So after this introduction, we'll then go into the core of this presentation. And the three ideas I want to present today are based on, number one, consider the mechanism of injury during rehab, target the muscles with appropriate exercises, and three, criteria-based return to play. So let's look at the first one. So consider the mechanism. As we said from the three studies presented before, we're looking at sprinting versus stretch-related type of injuries. So how does this affect our rehabilitation? So if we consider the acceleration mechanism, during rehab, we might try to focus our attention on acceleration exercise in the gym and on field. So some resisted acceleration, some work on isometric starts, some work on concentric exercise, explosive exercise to replicate that acceleration pattern. But also At the same time, do some exercise on field to practice that acceleration and to train the athlete to perform those type of very high intensity explosive actions. And the other part, the other mechanism within the sprinting mechanism is the high speed running. So one very interesting thing comes out from the study from Prince 2021 is that actually maximum sprinting activities appear to be the only way to achieve high muscle activity. So actually we don't have a gym-based exercise that can replicate the amount of forces that go through the hamstring during sprinting. So therefore, actually sprinting becomes a key exercise and becomes a key part of rehabilitation. So apart from exercise in the gym that can replicate those actions and try to load the hamstring in those type of running specific position, also sprinting becomes of primarily important for rehabilitation, to complete a rehabilitation program. And looking again at mechanism, as we said, so the stretch-related pattern divides into closed chain and open chain. So with closed chain, we're looking at prescribing exercise that include braking, stopping, deceleration movement with high eccentric force potential. And from a gym point of view, flywheel training could be, for example, a good option to achieve that high eccentric load, but also exercise like plyometrics, and obviously try and work on that stretch shortening cycle. For open chain type of injuries, so we said the open chain mechanism is when the athlete goes into hip flexion and knee extension. And we see that a lot in high kicks, for example, or when the player has to reach a high ball and then goes into this high hip flexion movement. So one of the advice for this type of mechanism is to actually try and target the hamstring strength in length and position. So try to put the athlete in the hip flexion position and try to load the hamstring in those very hand range positions. The second idea I wanted to present today is to target the hamstring muscles. As you see, I cited 3 articles at the bottom of the slide, and all these articles looked at hamstring activation during different hamstring exercises, and each study took in consideration slightly different exercises. I'm not going to go too much into the details of the exercises, but I think what we can definitely say is that we have obviously 2 big categories of exercises that we can use. So the hip dominant exercise and the knee dominant exercise. As we know, hamstring muscles are biarticular muscles, so they work as extensors of the hip and flexors of the knee. So we can actually use 2 movements, so the hip extension and the knee flexion, to strengthen the hamstrings. And from all these studies, what is coming out of those studies is actually hip dominant movement target more lateral hamstrings, so the biceps femoris, and more in a proximal area, while knee dominant exercise target mainly medial hamstrings, so semitend, semimember, and more into the distal part of the muscle. So by knowing this, when we rehab a hamstring, so we know that we can pick exercise to actually target specific areas. And if a player had, for example, proximal biceps femoris injury, we can focus on working specifically on that area by selecting certain type of exercise. Or in the first phase of rehab, when we want to just give the hamstring different exposure to different type of exercise, we can pick different exercise, more hip dominant, knee dominant, and combine them to have a more broad type of strength work. The third idea I wanted to present is criteria-based return to play. We've looked before studies on high recurrence of hamstring injuries. We know overall recurrence range from 17 to 34%, and especially early recurrence, so within the first 2 months, range from 8 to 17%. And these data come from the DEMER systematic review on the incidence of hamstring injuries in football. And in the figure on the right, you see how the different studies have been taken in consideration and the type of months that they looked at in terms of follow-ups following the injury. This slide, again, gives us the idea of how high the recurrence of hamstring injuries is and how important it is to have a strong criteria-based return to play. Another interesting thing to consider is that we're looking at this study by Rod Whiteley in 2020, and often professional players, when they return from a hamstring injury, do not return to previous level of high-speed running. And this was an interesting retrospective study on professional footballers, and they looked at competitive games before the injury and after the injury. And then if we look at the figure on the right, so you can see that the cluster values pre-injuries suggested there was a little game-to-game variance in terms of high-speed running. While when we go on and look at the right side of the graph, which is actually the post-injury part, then we'll see that actually the cluster values are much larger than pre-injury. And also, if we look at the dashed red line, which is showing the average high-speed running, on the right-hand side is definitely lower and is showing a suppression of high-speed running post-injury. So this is telling us that a lot of professional football players return from a hamstring injury and they don't perform as well as they did before from a high-speed running point of view, which we've seen is one of the potential mechanism of injury. But also, it's not just about running, because if we look at this study from Toll and colleagues in 2014, we see that they looked at 52 professional football players at the moment of discharge after an hamstring injury. And when they compare isokinetic tests with the uninjured leg, 67% of the clinically recovered hamstring injuries showed at least one hamstring, 67% of the clinically recovered hamstring showed a deficit of more than 10%. It's obviously important to say that the association between isokinetic deficit and re-injury risk remains unknown. So although the study showed that there was a deficit, there was no association with re-injury. But it's definitely an interesting thing to consider when we look at criteria to return to play, because obviously if we know that potentially there is a return to play with and now we go into our criteria-based return to play. So it's interesting to know that no studies have analyzed the most appropriate return to play criteria for hamstring injuries in professional football. There are other studies who've looked at criteria in different sports. Now, when we look in professional football, one of the things that we've seen is that, especially recently, a few surveys have been published on return to play criteria to try and really understand what practitioners do in football clubs. And when we look at some of these results, the Dunlop study, the Dunlop survey in 2019 looked at potential return to play continuum model. So not just talking about return to play, but phase this return to play. So to return to high speed running, which is the period between when the hamstring injuries occurs and then they return and then be clear to run on the field and progress towards high speed running. A return to train, which is obviously returning to unrestricted training with the squad. Return to play, when actually the player is cleared to return to play football in matches. And then return to performance, which is the last stage and is the return to pre-injury level. And as you can see in the infographic that summarizes the table and the contents of this survey, as you can see at the top, we have more clinical return to play criteria, which are quite used by different football clubs to clear the first for the first stage, so the return to high speed running. And then return to performance, the criteria become a lot more field based and a lot more functional. And then another survey was the 2017 Van der Horst survey. In this case, they did the Delphi study. So they asked a panel of 58 international experts to reach consensus regarding return to play terminology and definition, and also criteria for hamstring injuries. And based on the experts' opinion, you can see in the figure, they found some criteria in green, the ones that where they reached a consensus and they found them useful. On the right, in red, the ones who didn't find a consensus. And interesting, the middle one, so the orange part of the graph, is where consensus wasn't reached, but there was a potential, and that was around strength testing for return to play. So it's definitely a start point. It's definitely interesting to look at those surveys. I think from a clinical point of view, gives idea and gives a little bit of an overview of how different football clubs work. But there's definitely need for more studies and around return to play criteria for, especially for professional footballers. So these are sort of take-home messages and the messages I want to transfer to you with this presentation. So looking at mechanism, so knowing which type of mechanism for the hamstring injury, whether it was a sprinting or stretching mechanism, and how that can affect our rehab and what type of exercise we prescribe during our rehabilitation and on-field rehab. Looking at the type of exercise and how we can target specifically the area that got injured. So whether we use hip dominant or whether we use knee dominant exercises. And also trying to be objective and try to guide our decision making with objective data. So looking at criteria for return to play in professional football. We know that maybe there's a lack of high quality studies, but it's important to carry on doing them and carry on reading and trying to get information available in the literature. So I'm going to thank you for your attention and thank again Marco for the invitation and for opening this channel and give the opportunity to researchers and clinicians to share new ideas. And I really hope that you enjoy the presentation and you want to reach out and text me. Feel free to text me on LinkedIn or Instagram and just have a chat and hear your ideas. I think is really important to build a community of researchers and practitioners. So really happy to have discussion and hear your thoughts. Thanks again. Bye.